Yes.
Okay, great. So let me get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Linh My Truong. I'm an artist and educator based in Detroit. I grew up sewing and come from a fashion background. That's my main experience with textiles. And I generally considered myself more of a designer and maker who loved all sorts of textile processes like weaving, screen printing, embroidery, so on. But it wasn't really until I tried suminagashi for the first time that I even thought about creating art versus creating a product. So there was something just really special about the imagery and process that spoke to me immediately. Within, I would say, 5 minutes of trying it, I had already imagined large-scale projection of marbling for performance. So I've continued down that path ever since, and suminagashi remains integral to my work. So I wanted to start today by introducing suminagashi to you, and then later go into some of my work with suminagashi and electronics. So what is suminagashi? It is the Japanese art of marbling, and it translates to floating ink. So you can see the general process on your left. In its simplest form, you have one sumi brush with black ink and another brush with a surfactant to create the negative space in between the black rings. Alternating brushes, you would touch one brush at a time to the surface of the water to create concentric circles. And once enough ink has been added to the vat, you then use a fan or a stylus to manipulate the design and print on paper or silk or any other substrate. So on the right, you can see a real-life example of suminagashi on the top compared to the other type of marbling that people usually know about called Ebru marbling, Ebru Turkish marbling. It's much more common in the West, Turkish marbling is. You can see it anything from like antique European books or like 60s mod dresses, even the side of a Kleenex box. So because it's more prominent than suminagashi, I feel like, you know, I need to clarify that for people who might mistake it. So it differs from the Japanese tradition in that a substance is added to the water in the vat to thicken it and allow a minimum of paint movement. So you can use a stylus, or rakes are often used as well to create intricate repeating patterns. I think, well, I know suminagashi is marbling in its purest form. It's just ink floating on water. So as a result, there's a lot less control in the design. So just to give you an idea, here's a video of mine showing the process, and I'm just gonna change the playback speed so it goes a little quicker while I talk. So the marbler, Don Guillot, he once said about suminagashi that he doesn't teach how to do suminagashi, rather he teaches how to arrange things to allow suminagashi to occur. So I feel like this is an important distinction from the Turkish style of marbling. Many artists, and I'm sure some of you can relate to this, strive for perfection and complete control over their art making. Especially in the West, we have these Greek ideals of art and beauty and perfection. But with Eastern concepts, suminagashi is completely different. Suminagashi releases this need for control, and it expands your thinking to work with outside forces in your art. So for example, I sometimes like to marble outdoors under a tree because the wind blowing that particular day will blow the water in different ways. Sometimes if I'm under a tree, things will fall from the tree like leaves and it will fall into the vat, create another change. You bump into the table, that also can drastically change the work. So I see it as collaborating with nature. The result is constantly changing, unique patterns that never repeat. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to ask you all a question, if you're interested in interacting here. What does the imagery remind you of? So you can just shout out whatever comes to mind. Don't think too hard about it. I'm just curious as to what you think of it visually.
A map?
Map, like a topographical map?
Yes, like if I saw a globe. But now it's moving, so maybe it's something else.
Yeah, I've always asked my questions this because the process of it with inks on water is reminiscent of natural phenomena like, topographical, like geography. I get like the grain of wood a lot, rock formations, cosmos is something that I get. So suminagashi, you may not be aware of suminagashi, but it is something that the patterns do occur in nature itself. So once you see it, you may start seeing it everywhere. Like I see it when I pour cream into my coffee in the morning, or, on trees when I take a walk. So I challenge you to try and find examples in your life where this imagery occurs. So I wanted to briefly discuss the history of suminagashi. No one really knows who came up with the technique. There's a legend that it originally was used by Shinto priests for divinatory purposes. They would tell you your fortune based on the image that would emerge in the vat. But what we do know is the practice was a carefully guarded secret by the Horoba family from Echizen Prefecture for hundreds of years. So they have their own legend on its origins, stating an ancestor was gifted the technique at a Shinto shrine. The earliest known example of suminagashi dates back to the 12th century, which an example on the left is there. You can see that, they use suminagashi as background for like poetry, or sometimes it was just the corners of the paper that were marbled. But for over 400 years, suminagashi was just not available to the general public and was used exclusively by the imperial household and nobility. So there were proprietary and class issues with access to this technique. So as a result, the art form kind of remained stagnant during this time. There was really only one type of suminagashi. But then in the last few hundred years, the practice opened up to others around Japan, which allowed them to create different styles and experiment with the technique. And it was during this time that artists started printing on silk to create kimonos. And silk is actually my favorite substrate to print on because there's a high amount of detail and color saturation. So in 2017, I traveled to Japan to study with a suminagashi master named Tadao Fukuda. He's in his 90s, and he and his wife still practice suminagashi in the paper village of Echizen. It's like on the west coast between Kanazawa and Kyoto. There are not very many resources on suminagashi due to it being like a heavily guarded secret for hundreds of years. But there is a book on suminagashi written by a Western marbler, and Fukuda-san was featured as the first artist in this book. So I tried to track him down, which was pretty difficult in Japan, seeing as I don't speak any Japanese, but I was able to find an English speaker in his village who agreed to take me to his studio. So I kind of arrived by train that day, not really knowing if it would pan out, but it did. And it was a great experience. I learned a lot from him technique-wise, but also with how his studio is set up. You can see his card on the left of the picture. He had all his jars and ends of brushes color-coded, which is what I do with my inks now. And the example on the right is one of his prints. So this is a very traditional suminagashi look. The color combination of black, blue, and red is also very traditional. The black ink, they're all pigmented inks. So the black ink is made from pine soot. It's the same type of ink that's used in calligraphy. The blue is from indigo, and the red is from vermilion, which is a color Chinese people will recognize from red lacquerware. So Fukuda-san was known for his many use of colors. If you can see in the print he's holding in the photo. And just, generally it was a really important experience for me. I'm Vietnamese American. So as an artist practicing a traditional art outside of my personal heritage, I'm definitely wary of issues of cultural appropriation, it was really important for me to study the history and cultural context of suminagashi in Japan, and also travel to Japan to study the traditional techniques. Which leads me to my next slide, open source as cultural preservation. So it was one of the questions on Waze prompts for the techniques that really stood out to me, kind of the use of technology. How can we use technology to promote traditional arts? And this is definitely at the heart of what I want to do. I do see open source as a means for cultural preservation. When I studied with Fukuda-san, he mentioned to me that suminagashi is a dying art form in Japan. Its history in Japan is as a decorative paper art. So suminagashi artists, including Fukuda-san, were employed directly by paper mills as like their suminagashi expert. But in recent years, demand for handmade paper has died down. Many paper mills have closed over the years. And simply younger people don't see a career pathway there. So sometimes families that have had many multiple generations of suminagashi artists suddenly just stopped. So it's almost disappeared as in Japan as a result. When I was in Japan, many people I talked to never even heard of suminagashi, but they were familiar with shibori or katazome. So I decided as part of my art practice, I wanted to create free and open resources to spread the practice as much as possible in an attempt to preserve it and push it further experimentally. So this is an illustrated guide I made with my fiance, who's an illustrator. I'll post it on Slack if people are interested. I'm also happy to lead a demo of the technique for anyone who wants to join in. But definitely the educational part of suminagashi, educating others about it, is a big part of what I do with my art. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into some of the philosophical and scientific concepts behind suminagashi as far as I see it and how I apply it to my art. The first one is wabi-sabi, which is kind of the antithesis of that Greek beauty aesthetic ideal of perfection. It's a Japanese beauty aesthetic derived from the influence of Buddhism. And it can be summed up by saying, nothing lasts, nothing is finished, and nothing is perfect. So this is definitely something I teach in my classes as like a real, philosophical concept behind the process. Photo here is actually the art of kintsugi, which is where when ceramics get cracked, they fill it with a gold dusted lacquer to highlight its beauty and age rather than hide it. So wabi-sabi for me is kind of precisely why I love textiles. A mistake in a weaving to me is beautiful because I love to see the hand of the artist in the work. I love the way colors fade with natural dyes. So, I mean, nothing is supposed to last forever. I think a lot of people on this call probably could agree with that. So there's also an undeniably Zen Buddhist influence in suminagashi, beyond the concept of wabi-sabi, which also comes from Zen Buddhism. Suminagashi has a lot of similarities with Zen arts like ikebana, the art of flower arranging, tea ceremonies, calligraphy. It's not just about creating the beautiful things or objects. It's about the process as a form of meditation and finding stillness through repetitive action. I think this also applies to all textiles. But this is also how I approach and understand suminagashi. And I've taught it as a meditation class in the past and have also been in touch with numerous art therapists to try and figure out how they can incorporate suminagashi into their practice as a source of healing for some of their clients. So, and then in scientific terms, I am a nerd and I love science and technology. That's why I'm here. And I'm really fascinated with the scientific concepts behind suminagashi. Fluid dynamics plays a big part since the inks are literally just floating on water, but it also determines the chemicals and materials used to, chemicals and materials used to manipulate the ink. So I add a surfactant to the ink in order to lower the surface tension of the water and allow the ink to spread in the vat, as well as help the ink stay afloat long enough to make a print. So I experiment a lot with chemicals and water and ink, and just, I do a lot of experimentations with my techniques. So that's understanding fluid dynamics is high on my list. And I'm also fascinated by chaos theory as it relates to the unpredictability of suminagashi. So you might be familiar with chaos theory through the butterfly effect, which states that a small change in initial conditions can create a significantly different outcome. So this is certainly true with suminagashi, just subject to a number of outside natural forces other than the artist in the resulting pattern. I feel like just suminagashi is a great example of these scientific concepts playing out in real time. I'm also fascinated by the idea that complex chaotic systems have underlying patterns. So something that looks completely random is in fact not. So while I do create monoprints on paper and silk to create physical objects, I'm more focused on showing the process of suminagashi through video and performance. It's a choice over showing the dynamism of the process in itself rather than focusing on like a static print, which is really just like, you know, a photograph of what's going on. So I've started using a clear acrylic vat on a light projector to create videos of suminagashi. I'll just play this one. And then I blend it with found VHS footage, and I also do have been digging into analog video synthesis, creating analog video effects to layer on top. And on the right is a photo from a live performance I did. I also like to do large-scale projection with a light projector. And I actually have a performance coming up this month as part of New York Textile Month. It's on Sunday, September 27th. So I'll post info about that performance this month on Slack in case you're interested, and you can get a better idea of the live performance aspect. This particular performance I'm really excited about because it's a collaboration with my fiance who creates sound design music on modular synths. So we're experimenting with ways the performance can be mutually reactive, almost like a feedback loop. So my forays into electronics have been through installation. This is an installation I created last year with capacitive touch sensors and projection mapping. So I'm just going to play this for you. So Winter Circle is the name of a hexagon-shaped star constellation. It's a nod to suminagashi resembling the cosmos. It's silk on a hexagonal frame I made, and the seams have lines of conductive threads sewn onto it. And I then use an Arduino and a laptop running max MSP jitter to take information from the sensors and trigger different effects, which are then sent to MadMapper, which is the program I use for projection mapping. And the videos actually run at different lengths, so the piece is never the same. It's always changing in the same way suminagashi does. I wanted to use touch sensors, particularly as a mode of interaction for the viewer, because I personally believe textiles are meant to be touched. And I find it frustrating sometimes going to textile exhibitions where I'm like, I want to touch it so bad, but touching is strictly off limits in that sort of context. And I wanted to create a work that would encourage touching and interacting with the piece. Unfortunately, with the rise of COVID, touching any surface right now is not really a good idea. So I'm shelving this series for now, and until further notice. And now I'm focusing on another project of mine, weaving with EL wire. So this is the beginning of a new series of work I'm calling Light Waves, which is also the technique I want to share with you as for my first swatch. I love tapestry weaving. I've been experimenting with suminagashi imagery and tapestry weaving for a couple of years now. I consider light as a material in my work with projection and performance and video. So I wanted to incorporate EL wire into my design. I'll just play this. There's no sound on this one. I consider light as a material. Yeah, so in this way, using EL wire, I have also using an Arduino and a shield to connect the EL wire and program the light sequences. So I also posted the Arduino code on the wiki for you. It has timers for each light to blink at different time intervals. So they come together at certain moments and then diverge again, creating a sort of polyrhythmic light pattern. I'm currently experimenting with sound sensors to add an interactive element that is touch-free. So there are definitely will be more iterations of this work that's interactive. And a couple of you have already even mentioned using fiber optic cables to me. It's also something I'd love to explore just because EL wire does have its limitations as well. Yeah, so that could be, I would be really open to collaborating with anyone on that project. I haven't sourced any of the material yet, but I've definitely been looking into it. And it just would you'd be able to change colors using LEDs, RGB LEDs. So there's a lot more to explore there with weaving light. So yeah, that's, and here's just like a little closer look at what it looks like when it's not on. So I essentially took a piece of wood and, created a tapestry loom out of that with nails and then warped invisible nylon thread onto the loom and then wove the EL wire through the invisible thread, which it is as difficult as it sounds. I fortunately have been using invisible thread as warp threads for a minute. So I've also been playing around with that and experimenting with it. I have to use like a really bright light at an angle in order to see the threads while I'm weaving. And I also, just because the EL wires are thicker than regular yarn you would use in tapestry, I also use pliers to pull the EL wire through. So it is quite a process that is not super easy, but I do enjoy it. And yeah, that's it for my presentation. I'd love to hear if any of you have questions.
Thank you, Lynn. Do we have any questions for Lynn right now?
I have one. First, thank you so much for all of this. This was really, really cool and really interesting. Has anyone, to your knowledge, made a CNC suminagashi machine?
No, not to my knowledge. I mean, like I said, it's usually suminagashi has grown in popularity with Western marblers, with just the rise of the internet and YouTube videos. But it's mostly in a print format, so it's mostly monoprints is what you see on paper or physical objects. So yeah, nothing. I haven't seen anything like that yet, but that's really a cool idea.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you.
Do you have CNC knowledge?
Yeah, I've built a few things. I'm not gonna go into the forest with a pocket knife and build a sintered laser, 3D printer. But yeah, I can do Arduino and stepper motors. That's all super straightforward open source stuff now. So maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Cool.
Great, you find your teammate.
Yeah.
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for Lynn, because the skill, because I've watched your tutorial video on your website, and it seems like the pattern could be from very simple to very complicated, as you show that designed by the master. Then I'm wondering because it's you cannot go back process that do you design the process or the color combination before you start doing anything?
That's a really good question. I do choose my color palette in advance, and I mix inks together to get different combinations. But the actual process itself is like always improvisational for me. You know, I definitely have certain techniques where I know sort of what is going to happen, but even when I think I know what's going to happen, something else entirely happens. So that's the part of like releasing control in the process and allowing it to evolve on its own that I think is really an important lesson for all artists and probably people generally.
I see. Thank you. Do we have any question for Lynn, or we are going to move forward? All right. Thank you, Lynn. And
Thank you.
If you have any questions later, you can ask her. And so next one we're